Hello watch enthusiasts! Now today I'd like to speak about a recent acquisition for my collection, the Omega Speedmaster Mark III. And the Mark III epitomises the early 1970s for Omega when they were trying to find a new direction for the Speedmaster, but also provide an automatic chronograph movement, and this was the first watch to have it. And so this is a watch which is in many ways quite historically interesting, and a piece which I've been fascinated with for several years now. And it's a piece which I decided to buy over a year ago and add to the collection by the end of 2018, and so I'm very glad to be able to say I've finally found a piece which really fitted my criteria in terms of a piece I wanted to own in the collection. And in this video I'd like to speak briefly about the history of this watch, but also about the process of buying the piece, which proved a great deal of a struggle, with quite a few pitfalls to be avoided, which I found out really through reading about other people's experiences, but also through searching the market myself, and also speak about the watch itself in all its technology, and also the design of this watch, which is, to really say it clearly, rather unique. Now, when speaking about the Mark III, I think stylistically one has to accept that this really is a product of the early 1970s. Its design is extremely bold and very forward-looking, and in many ways a real opposite to the designs of the 1960s, which are much smaller, more delicate, and in many ways much more traditional. And so before speaking about this watch directly, I'd like to speak about the design influences which came before this piece, because I feel they give a great deal of information on what this watch became. Because really the idea of the Mark III, and indeed the Mark series in general, was derived from the idea of replacing the original Speedmaster Professional. And of course the Speedmaster Professional was extremely famous at this stage for its use in space. But in 1969 Omega tried to replace it with the Mark II, with a tonneau style of case, with brushed and polished forms, and a design which today still seems relatively sedate and quite contained, but in the day was a significant change to the original form. It also featured several innovations, such as a mineral crystal, something which was carried over to this timepiece, in addition to an internal bezel as opposed to the external tachymeter of the previous Speedmaster. It did still retain the same 861 movement though, in addition to also retaining the general design of the Speedmaster Professional with its black dial and no date. The other influence, which is a major element to this timepiece, is the Flightmaster. And the Flightmaster was also released in 1969 as a new piece from the chronograph line of Omega. And it's a piece which was really a standalone model. It didn't sit in any of the other lines such as Speedmaster or Seamaster, and instead was simply the Flightmaster. It featured the first of this particular style of case, with the hooded lugs and the fully brushed form with these vertical sides, and in many ways a much more delicate form though to the Mark III, because it wasn't quite such an abrupt form with such tall sides and such a bold design on the wrist. But it did mark the start of this design, and of course served to demonstrate the functionality of a watch like this for a pilot, for instance. And the Flightmaster has become a very valuable piece and a very sought-after piece as well, but also contributed to this watch with the addition of a 24-hour indicator, which in this watch is seen at 9 o'clock, which was also where it was seen on that version from the Flightmaster, though of course they used very different movements as the Flightmaster was manually wound. But in many ways, a really major drive behind the Mark III was the introduction of the Lemania 1340 and 1341 movements. Now these were the first automatic chronographs from Lemania, and Lemania was a long-time movement supplier for Omega. For instance, the caliber 321, which we so commonly associate with the early Speedmasters, was a product of Lemania. And so it's not surprising that this movement fitted into the Omega, and of course was co-developed with Omega as well. However, Omega rebranded it as the caliber 1040, and later on as the 1041 in its chronometer version for the Speedmaster 125. But either way, this was a movement which was very much a groundbreaking piece, because it didn't come out in 1969, but slightly later, in the early 70s. And what it offered were some standout features, such as the 24-hour indicator on the same subdial as the running seconds, in addition to central minutes for the chronograph. Now, in terms of specifications, the Omega movement was somewhat different to the Lemania movement, because the Omega movements almost always had 22 joules, where the Lemania movements had either 17 or 22, depending upon the version, and also featured a golden brass colour, as opposed to the silver of the Lemania models. However, the design of these movements was the same in its general form, and these were 8mm thick and were 13.75 or 13 3/4 lines in their width. Now they were also interestingly designed by Albert Piguet, and this individual who led the design team, in fact, of this movement, is interesting in the fact that he started work on automatic chronographs as early as 1946, showing the importance of this as a development, but also the fact that until this stage it wasn't deemed important to have an automatic chronograph, where in the 1940s it would have been a real standout feature, but wasn't deemed necessary. Otherwise, these watches and these movements showed another change and certainly an increase in terms of features based upon their previous forebears, being the 861 movements from Omega, which were their cam-operated chronographs, which were manually wound. Now, the power reserve did drop somewhat by about 4 hours to 44 hours, but the beat rate increased from 21,600 vibrations per hour, or 6 ticks per second, to 8 ticks per second at 28,800, which is a much more modern beat rate and gave a much smoother tick to the second hand. Also, these featured bidirectional winding with a central rotor on the movement, which, whilst adding to the thickness of the watch, did make them much more practical in terms of winding themselves, which was something very new. However, the way the chronograph operated was something both new but also taking from Omega's history, because where Omega had moved to cam-operated chronographs, this also featured that, and if I just start the chronograph, you'll see that it starts off very well, but as you can see features quite a smooth tick to the second hand as a result of that higher beat rate. That also reveals the hand beneath the chronograph hand, which is the running minute hand. And this features those wing-like protrusions which appear to be an aeroplane in form, but also allow that hand to be legible even when it's underneath the other hands, showing you the amount of minutes that have elapsed when you're running the chronograph. Similarly, this hand doesn't tick from minute to minute, but rather runs flowingly from minute to minute, which is something different to previous movements, and made the watch more legible in terms of being able to see it on this larger scale now centrally placed. But where the dials of these watches were concerned, and the hands, there were significant variations from model to model. Now, early models from 1971 didn't feature professional on the dial. Instead, the automatic signature that you see at 3 o'clock on this watch was placed at the 12 o'clock position underneath Speedmaster. However, by 1972 this was changed to professional dials, where one had Speedmaster Professional there instead, and the automatic was moved to 3 o'clock. Personally, I prefer this layout, though it is less rare, of course, because it gives a greater balance to the dial. But there were also 3 dials available. Now, the one which is often seen is the black dial, which is my favourite, and is indeed this version, which featured a matte black dial in the Speedmaster Professional style, with that traditional style of pilot's indicator at 12 o'clock to show the 12 o'clock indicator. But also it didn't feature applied indices, but rather painted ones, and featured numerals around the dial as well. This piece also featured more professional style hands, though 2 different types of hand were available, with this particular style of hand being my personal preference, with this full-length hand, whereas some syringe hands were also available. It should be noted, though, these hands are different to the standard Speedmaster Professional ones, due to the way the loom plot is placed and the way they're different thicknesses. But the other 2 dial variants are much more bright, because these came with either a dark blue style of sunburst dial, with orange elements on the hands, or indeed similar hands and a similar blue bezel on a sunburst silver dial as well. Now, aside from the dial variations, there were 2 cases available, and the 2 cases were seen in either this circular brushed finish, or in a sunburst style of finish where the brushing went from the centre of the case outwards, and so down the case as opposed to around it. And so far as we can see, there was no difference in which models received which case. It was purely luck. Though one can say, though, that some early models were more likely to have the sunburst effect case on the basis that they're simply seen more often, where one sees the combination of having no professional on the dial and the sunburst style case, though both are correct. And this is very similar to the hands, where one sees both syringe and straight hands, as again both of these forms were correct for this timepiece. Now, buying these watches can be a real struggle, and as a part of this video I really would like to put an emphasis on, because it's an interesting point, because one would have thought that a watch which in many ways is less collectible than a conventional Speedmaster would be easier to come across. However, this is far from the case, on the basis that one sees a great deal of these watches where the seller doesn't disclose all of the information regarding what the watch is, or simply doesn't understand what this information is, or just chooses not to disclose it. And this makes buying these quite complicated, with a great deal of pitfalls and potential mistakes and difficulties, because of course one doesn't have all the information available. However, of course, the beauty of being able to research these on the internet is that one can really compare pieces and try and establish what the best option is. And there are a great deal of models with real discrepancies I've seen from some very reputable sellers, which I won't mention or name in this video because I feel that would be incorrect. But I've seen examples of Mark IIIs with Mark II casebacks, for example, where this isn't disclosed by the seller, And likewise, one sees examples where the movement is described as in very good condition, where one sees a great deal of corrosion to the movement, dirt within the movement, and also replacement rotors which aren't designated or explained. And it is important to note that the rotor holds the serial number of the watch, and so it's quite important to be able to tell that, to be able to establish more information about the timepiece itself. However, amongst all of these pieces, one has to really go down the line of trying to find a watch which is in the best condition for the price. Now, bearing in mind the fact that these watches aren't particularly collectible, I wouldn't view originality as the be-all and end-all. And whilst I do feel it's important to have a piece with all Omega parts, if you do get a piece with some elements which aren't quite as you would hope they were on the original, I don't view this as quite such a disaster as on, for example, a vintage Submariner from Rolex, because those have a much greater following where professional collectors are concerned. However, when buying this piece, I really tried to look for a piece which had the greatest quality of maintenance. And so this piece, for example, has a movement which is impeccably well maintained. There's no corrosion visible, and it runs extremely well, in fact, within cost parameters, which is pretty baffling for a watch nearly 50 years old. Also, this watch is fully resealed with new seals, which is quite important to preventing moisture from getting in and damaging the dial. And this is an element which you'll notice about this watch, is the dial is very, very well preserved. Now, the dial doesn't appear to be refinished in any way, which is a real blessing, because often one sees badly refinished dials, which is a bit of a shame because the original design and the original finishing is lost. But as you can see, this dial is very, very well preserved with its original matte black coloration, and with some very minor marks to it, but which haven't been remedied, which I do like. One also notices that the dial has these sunken subdials, which were key to these models, and of course match that subdial at 9 o'clock, which features that central ring which rotates and originally would have been luminous, which shows the 24 hours beneath that running second hand. You'll also notice the luminescence on this watch is, or rather would originally have been glowing tritium, though now it's decayed to the point where it doesn't glow anymore because the half-life is only 13 years, so really within about 25 years there's no glow left to these. The hands, on the other hand, appear to be original in terms of their finishing and in terms of their design, because they match the dial where their paint is concerned. However, I do think they may have been reloomed at some stage as a result of the fact the loom doesn't match the dial, and the fact there does appear to be a coloration difference, and it does appear to be better preserved. However, this doesn't bother me particularly, because really very often one finds original hands in extremely poor condition, and so I'm willing to take service hands from Omega over those original hands if they're well maintained. Now, the most difficult element about buying one of these watches, though, isn't so much the case, the dial and the movement, but rather is getting a watch which brings all of these elements together. Now, my objective when buying this watch was to get a watch I could enjoy every day and be able to wear with confidence and without concern as to the mechanical integrity of the piece. However, unfortunately, what one often finds is that watches with a well-maintained movement have very heavily refinished cases, and watches with original cases, which often have a great deal of damage to them, have very poorly maintained movements and damaged dials and hands. And so, really with this watch, I was trying to find a suitable halfway house, because due to the fact there isn't a massive collector's following for these watches, one doesn't see very often pieces which have been treated with the same care as Speedmasters from other references. And so, where cases are concerned, the piece I ended up getting is an example of a successful rebrushing. And I say that lightly and quite delicately, because there's a great deal of variation in the finishing of a case depending upon how it's refinished, whether it's very lightly rebrushed or very aggressively rebrushed. And with these watches, one often sees either a case which has been rebrushed or repolished. Now, the repolished ones tend to be less desirable, because this is where the actual brushed finish of the case has been polished entirely out. And this is usually done with some sort of polishing wheel, or sometimes manually, but it removes the original texture of the case, and also removes these sharp edges, which means that the case loses its original form, and in many ways is much less desirable. The other approach to refinishing these cases, which is often seen on the market, is rebrushing. And this is seen where the case is given a new brushed finish, which follows the original lines, and one keeps, for example, the sharp edges, but one does lose some of the symmetry of the case. So, for example, one sees slight differences in the length of the sides of the case. And whilst these are rather minor, it still is something which you wouldn't want if you wanted pure originality. And of course, to get a truly original one of these, one would have to spend a great deal more, because it's so difficult to find them due to the fact that they just don't tend to come out in the market. But where I was looking for this watch, I was looking for something which would sit somewhere in between. And so with this piece, I was able to find a case which was largely well preserved, though admittedly it has suffered some refinishing on the sides, for example, where a great deal of metal has been taken off. But really my priority with this watch was a very, very well preserved movement. And that I certainly have got where this watch runs within cost parameters, which is quite remarkable for a near 50-year-old watch. However, I have found one element which also has been changed, which is the crown, which is a more modern Omega Speedmaster crown as opposed to the original. However, I've been able to find an original replacement crown from the early 70s, which was designed for the Mark III, but crucially, and I would like to make this quite clear, is not taken from another timepiece, and so I'm not producing some sort of Franken-watch as is often described, where people cobble together different parts from different references and different watches to create a single timepiece in better condition. Instead, this is the crown I will have fitted is an original crown from Omega from that period that just wasn't used. A similar thing goes for the case, because I have been able to get hold of, quite by chance actually, an original Speedmaster Mark III case. Now crucially that follows the same lines as the crown, because I really refuse to put a case used on another watch and salvaged from another watch on this piece, because that would compromise my integrity, but also the integrity of the watch as an original timepiece. So what I was able to find was a completely new old stock case, still with stickers and full signature from Omega, from the early 70s. And so it was simply a case that was never used on a watch as opposed to one which was taken from another. And I will point out, just before I'm accused of creating some sort of strange form of hybrid of different pieces, the case and indeed this original case will both be kept if I ever sell the watch. And so if ever I do sell the watch, the buyer will have both cases, as opposed to having a replacement case, which is often a risk on this market, where one often sees these pieces with incorrect movement parts, incorrect dials, incorrect hands, and incorrect case backs. Now at this point in the video, I feel it really is worthwhile showing the watch on the wrist, because it is just such an incredible piece to see. Now whilst these pieces aren't as collectible as, for example, the manually wound Speedmasters of the mid-60s, I do think they hold their own in terms of looking absolutely unique. As you can see, the depth of the case isn't a problem really, because it curves over so heavily, but of course this won't fit under a formal cuff, though quite frankly I wouldn't want it to, because that's really part of the enjoyment of this piece as an item of technological prowess, and a demonstration of really Omega's development in that period. But certainly I think it is rather a beautiful watch in terms of showing something which is completely different, and with a real celebration of stainless steel in this form, which is almost sculptural in terms of its design, which I think looks absolutely wonderful, in addition to that Speedmaster writing on the dial. And you will also notice that it has Speedmaster in its older style of logo, with the curved over S and the elongated R, which you don't see today on Speedmaster signatures on the dial, and which is nice to see on a watch of this sort. But nonetheless, it's a really wonderful piece to wear, and I've been enjoying it for several weeks now, as a quite remarkable item of history, but also of horology. Now as I draw to the end of this video, I'm very interested to hear what you think of this watch and its design, because it is a real acquired taste, but rather a beautiful one at that in my eyes, which encompasses Omega's technology in the period, and a really unique design which we will most likely never see again from the Omega range or line. But I'm also interested to hear what your favourite reference of Speedmaster is, especially in light of First Man, the movie about Neil Armstrong being released, which I must say, if you haven't seen, I would urge you to go and see, both for the horological pornography, quite frankly, of a variety of Speedmasters from the 1960s, but also in terms of just being a really phenomenal demonstration of NASA in the 1960s. And so do tell me in the comments down below what your favourite Speedmaster is, because I'm very interested to hear. But if you did enjoy the video, then please do like, share and subscribe to help the channel, and also to be able to see more videos here in future. And so thank you very much for watching. This is Armand the Watch Guy, out.